The wheels of a suitcase whispered across the polished floor of Westbridge International as a woman in a navy suit moved through the terminal with a calmness that defied the noise around her. Dr. Celeste Monroe, poised, deliberate, commanding without a single word. But power in the wrong eyes looked suspicious. 2 officers watched her, followed her, judged her, and in a heartbeat, suspicion turned into handcuffs and arrogance turned into a fatal mistake, because what they didn't know was that the woman they tried to humiliate wasn't just any traveler. She was the director of the FBI. And before the morning was over, they wouldn't just lose their badges, they would become the lesson the world would never forget. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? And if you believe real strength doesn't need to shout to change everything, hit like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that cut deeper than headlines. The sound of suitcase wheels against polished tile echoed beneath the vaulted glass ceiling of Westbridge International Airport. Beneath the high arches of Terminal B, a quiet rhythm of travelers passed, unnoticed families, reuniting executives rushing to gates, attendants calling for boarding. Amid the noise, a woman stood alone in the morning light. Dr. Celeste Monroe. Her posture was impeccable, her movements deliberate. She wore a tailored navy suit that complemented her deep brown skin and a silk blouse the color of bone china. Her heels clicked softly as she moved with quiet purpose toward the exit, but someone was watching her. Officer Mason Green leaned against a column near the customs checkpoint. Arms crossed, blue eyes narrowed with suspicion, cloaked in superiority. His partner, Jake Donnelly, younger and clearly less certain, followed his lead. A few paces behind Green, gave a slight nod. "There," he muttered, pushing off the wall. "Let's see what her story is." Celeste was just reaching for her phone to call her driver when the 2 officers stepped into her path. "Ma'am," Green said, falsely polite. "We need to ask you a few questions." Celeste looked up, her eyes cool but not surprised. "Is there a reason, officer?" "Just a routine check." Donnelly added, his voice thinner, less confident. "Random screening." Celeste raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course." She reached into her bag and calmly produced her passport and boarding documents. Her credentials were flawless: U.S. citizen, returning from a cybersecurity summit in Brussels. Nothing irregular. Green skimmed the passport, eyes lingering longer than necessary. "These are awfully nice things," he remarked, gesturing toward her matching luggage and leather handbag. "Not something we see every day." Celeste didn't respond. "You travel alone often, Dr. Monroe?" Green asked, drawing out the word doctor. "Like a dare I do," she said. "Is there a problem?" He leaned in slightly. "You seem unusually successful. Must be some job." "Cybersecurity," she replied. "I lead an international team." Green let out a short laugh, loud and sarcastic. "Sure you do." Donnelly shifted his fingers, fidgeting near his utility belt. Passers-by slowed, then kept walking. The subtle threat of authority hung heavy in the air. "We'll need to check your bags," Green said. "Do you have probable cause?" Celeste asked, her voice steady, unthreatening but firm. "If not, I'd like to continue on my way." Green's expression hardened. "That's enough. You're being uncooperative. Hands where I can see them." Without waiting for permission or further explanation, he motioned to Donnelly. "Cuff her." "What?" Donnelly whispered. "You heard me." Donnelly hesitated. Then slowly he removed the cuffs from his belt and reached forward. Celeste didn't flinch. She stood still as the cold metal clicked around her wrists as strangers stared and phones were discreetly lowered instead of raised. The humiliation was precise, deliberate, and unwarranted. But still, Celeste Monroe remained composed. As her hands were restrained, her eyes moved not in fear but calculation. Green's badge number 4581, Donnelly's 3277. She marked their stances, the angle of the surveillance cameras, the time on the overhead departure screen. She wasn't panicking. She was documenting. In silence. Because Dr. Celeste Monroe understood something. Officer Green didn't. The mistake wasn't hers, and it had just been made in full view of a federal agency that didn't take mistakes lightly. The handcuffs were tight, unnecessarily so, but Dr. Celeste Monroe didn't complain. She stood beside the row of chrome benches near the baggage carousel, her back straight, wrists bound, and gaze steady. Officer Mason Green leaned in with theatrical casualness, like a man who mistook power for cleverness. "Here's the thing," he began, voice low but intentionally loud enough to be overheard. "We could drag this out." Celeste didn't move. "You know how this goes?" Green continued, gesturing vaguely to the open space around them. "Airport procedures. secondary screening. The whole process could take hours, maybe days. She remained silent. Green stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. But maybe we don't have to go that route. Officer Jake Donnelly stood a few feet away, shifting from foot to foot. He didn't speak, but his eyes flicked nervously between Celeste and his partner. "You're clearly a woman of means," Green said, letting his gaze drop to the crocodile handbag at Celeste's feet, then slowly rise back to her face. "Elegant watch. Shoes that cost more than my paycheck. So maybe we settle this now." Celeste's lips didn't even twitch. Green dropped the pretense of subtlety. "A gesture of goodwill," he said. "You slide us $1,000. We chalk this up as a misunderstanding. We both walk away clean. You catch your flight. I forget this ever happened." Donnelly blinked. "Mason," he muttered, barely audible. Green didn't acknowledge him. "You don't want to miss your next flight, do you?" He pressed, smirking now, emboldened by Celeste's silence. "You people know how to be generous. Help us out. Help yourself." His smile faded into something colder when she didn't respond. "Oh, I see." "Playing the strong type?" Green asked, tilting his head. "Don't make this difficult, ma'am. Don't mistake quiet for power." Celeste's stare didn't waver. She didn't even blink. Passengers drifted by, some turned to look, some paused, some even raised their phones, but no one acted. The sight of a black woman in handcuffs being leaned over by two officers didn't spark alarm, just discomfort, just avoidance. And that was the point. The humiliation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the tone, the smirk, the assumption. Green took another step closer. "I'm being generous here. Could have booked you already. Could have emptied your bags in front of everyone. But I'm giving you a chance to save face." Still Celeste said nothing. No panic. No protest. Just a stare that sliced through the smugness, quietly, surgically. "You don't have anything to say?" Green asked, his tone growing sharp with frustration. "Not even a thank you?" "She hasn't done anything wrong," Donnelly said suddenly. His voice was soft, uncertain, but audible. Green turned to him sharply. "What did you say?" Donnelly opened his mouth, then closed it. That was all Celeste needed. She had everything now. Green's attempt at extortion. Donnelly's hesitation. The location. The time, the surveillance angles. The words. Every cruel syllable. Celeste Monroe didn't need to argue. She just needed to wait. Quietly, patiently. Because the real authority was already on its way, and the people standing before her were too arrogant to realize how deeply they'd already lost. Officer Mason Green was growing impatient. "You know what," he snapped, stepping back. "Fine. You want to play silent? Play tough. We'll just take this to the station. Let you explain yourself to someone less patient than I am." He motioned to Donnelly. "Let's go." Donnelly hesitated again. His hand hovered near Celeste's arm, unsure whether to follow orders or his own sinking instincts. But before he could act, Celeste finally spoke. Her voice was measured, clear, completely calm. "I need my phone." Green turned slowly. "Excuse me. My phone," she repeated. "In the side zipper of my handbag. I need to make a call." "Oh, do you?" "Now," Green sneered. "Let me guess you're calling your assistant, your publicist. Gonna tweet about this injustice and shame us in front of your 20,000 followers." His sarcasm was sharp, too sharp. It revealed his unease. Donnelly, still visibly unsettled, glanced toward the bag. "Should we let her?" Green waved dismissively. "Sure. What's the harm? Let her feel like she's in control for a minute. It won't change a thing." Donnelly crouched, retrieved the sleek black phone from the pocket she'd described, and handed it to her. Her wrists were still cuffed, but Celeste maneuvered the device with quiet ease, tapping in a sequence with precise, practiced movements. Voice recognition, encrypted clearance. The screen lit up with a seal neither of them recognized. Celeste lifted the phone to her ear, her tone shifted. Still calm, but unmistakably authoritative. "This is Dr. Celeste Monroe," she said, each word clipped and exact. "Confirm identity code, Alpha 6, Bravo, November. I'm at Westbridge International Airport, Terminal 2, near Gate C14. I am currently in police custody under false pretense. Officers involved: Mason Green badge 2791, Jake Donnelly badge 3127. This is a Level 1 priority incident. I need immediate contact with Deputy Director Alvarez." Green froze. Donnelly's mouth dropped open slightly. Celeste glanced at them briefly, then turned away to finish the call. Yes, I'll remain stationary. Tell Agent Alvarez, I'll wait for his team here. She paused, then added with absolute finality, initiate full protocol. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Donnelly without a word. The silence around them was deafening. Green's voice cracked slightly when he finally managed to speak. Wait, what did you just say? Level 1? Who exactly did you just call? Celeste turned her gaze on him. Composed, steely, unshaken, the Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, she said. Then, with chilling precision, she added, and I am Dr. Celeste Monroe, Director of the FBI. Donnelly stumbled back a step. Green's face drained of color. His hands dropped to his sides, the confident smirk, the smug posture gone. The terminal seemed to grow quieter around them. Celeste did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply stood as she had from the start, elegant, unbothered, in complete control. You just tried to extort the wrong person, she said, her voice quiet but cutting. And now you'll learn what that mistake costs. And somewhere in the distance, near the terminal's far end, black-suited agents had already begun to arrive. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a few agonizing seconds, the entire terminal seemed to pause. Green's face had gone a ghostly shade of white. His jaw twitched. His breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. Donnelly, standing beside him, looked like he'd just been shoved into icy water, his eyes wide, his posture crumbling. You're lying, Green said, but his voice had no conviction. You can't be. Celeste didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she raised the cuffed hands in front of her just slightly and looked calmly toward the corridor where a flash of movement had begun to stir. Black suits, earpieces, swift coordinated steps. It had begun. Green's hands started to tremble. He grabbed for something, his radio, his badge, a scrap of dignity. Donnelly took a step back. She said, Level 1. He whispered more to himself than to anyone. She said, Deputy Director Alvarez. He turned to Green. That's not a joke, Mason. That's FBI protocol. You know what that means? No. Green snapped, his voice cracking. This is a mistake. She's bluffing. She's dressed like a CEO. There's no way she's... But even as he said it, he knew, because no one who was bluffing would be this calm, because no one could say, Level 1 priority with that kind of command and not mean it. And because now, through the glass wall behind them, they could see a dark SUV pulling up to the curb. Fast, silent, precise. Two black-suited agents exited without hesitation, heading toward the terminal doors. Celeste turned slightly and looked at Green, her voice low and sharp. I gave you my name, I gave you my title, and I gave you a moment to reconsider, but you chose arrogance over caution, prejudice over professionalism. She stepped forward, once her gaze unwavering. You saw a successful black woman alone and confident, and instead of asking who I was, you decided who I must be. Green opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Donnelly tried to speak. Director Dr. Monroe. Ma'am, we didn't know. We didn't mean. Celeste cut him off with a single glance. You don't need to tell me what you meant, she said. I've lived it. I know exactly what you meant. Then she added as the agents entered the terminal and moved in their direction. And now the system you thought you understood is about to remind you that ignorance doesn't excuse misconduct. She looked toward the approaching agents and gave a subtle nod. Behind her, the faint clicking of leather shoes echoed off the polished airport floor. It was too late to undo what they'd done. And now for Officers Green and Donnelly, the realization had set in. They hadn't just profiled the wrong passenger. They'd handcuffed the head of the FBI, and the consequences were already walking through the door. The calm before the storm lasted less than 90 seconds. Then everything changed. The terminal's polished silence cracked as the glass doors swung open with a sharp hiss. A coordinated group of plainclothes agents surged in black suits, steel eyes, every step crisp and exact. Their movement cut through the drifting crowd like a scalpel. A man in the center, tall and composed, led with measured authority. His badge flashed at his waist. Special Agent in Charge, Martin Keller, FBI New York Field Office, Dr. Monroe, Keller said the moment he reached her, voice low and clear, his tone laced with urgency and deference. We received your call. Are you physically harmed? Celeste gave a single nod, her hands still bound. No injuries. But these two, she said, glancing toward the officers, need to be processed immediately. I've already given their names and badge numbers. They attempted to extort me, racially, profiled me, and placed me in restraints without probable cause. Keller's jaw clenched. Understood. He turned to his team. Secure the perimeter. Lock down the terminal section. No one in or out without clearance. Passenger flow diverts to gate 14. We're holding here. Chaos moved in slow motion as TSA officers, Port Authority staff, and confused travelers looked on. An agent approached the airport's central console and initiated the lockdown. Security lights blinked amber. Overhead, a muffled announcement began looping in multiple languages, citing an emergency systems check in progress. Keller turned his full attention to the two men now frozen in place. Officers Green and Donnelly, he said, voice cold and even. You are being relieved of your service. Weapons and authority effective immediately. Place your sidearms on the ground. Now Green hesitated for a beat too long, panic rippling across his face. Keller didn't flinch. I will not repeat myself. With a trembling hand, Green reached for his holster and slowly laid his gun on the floor. Donnelly followed, more stunned than defiant, his hands visibly shaking. Two FBI agents moved in, collected the weapons, removed the officers' radios, then reached for their badges. The sound of metal being unsnapped from leather and placed into evidence pouches echoed louder than it should have. Green finally spoke. This is a misunderstanding. We didn't know who she was. Keller cut him off with a look. You didn't need to know who she was. You needed to know the law. Behind them, another agent approached Celeste and carefully unlocked the handcuffs. The metal released with a quiet click, and she slowly rubbed her wrists red from the pressure. The gesture was small, but the symbolism was vast. The hunted had just become the highest-ranking authority in the room. Keller turned towards Celeste again. We're preserving the scene. I've already pulled security footage from the last 20 minutes. We've also seized both officers' body cams. Technical forensics is en route. Statements will be collected from all witnesses and personnel. Celeste nodded once. Good. I want everything documented, especially Green's exact words. A nearby agent already transcribing lifted a tablet. Already done. Director Celeste's eyes scanned the terminal. Watching passengers whisper phones raised silent questions burning in the air, but no one stepped forward earlier. Not one. Still now. Justice was moving, not just because of who she was, but because she had waited. She had let them hang themselves with their own assumptions. Now the system they had hoped to manipulate was moving relentlessly, precisely. And officers Mason Green and Jake Donnelly, they were no longer in control. They were evidence. What began with arrogance and handcuffs was now a federal case echoing from coast to coast. Within 48 hours, jurisdiction had fully shifted. The Department of Justice issued a formal statement. Due to the gravity of the incident and the involvement of a federal officer, all investigative and prosecutorial authority will be exercised at the federal level. Behind that bureaucratic phrasing was a storm-gathering momentum. The Eastern District's lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Layla Mendoza, was swift, sharp, and unrelenting. She didn't do interviews, she built convictions, and she knew exactly what this case was. A moment, a symbol, a statement. She assigned her most experienced investigators to work directly with Special Agent in Charge Martin Keller's team. The case file titled United States v. Green and Donnelly grew rapidly, fed by footage, witness accounts, internal memos, and a quietly damning personnel record. The cornerstone of the prosecution's strategy was twofold: the Hobbs Act, which criminalizes extortion affecting interstate commerce, and Title 18 U.S. Code, Section 242, which covers the deprivation of rights under color of law. Both Green and Donnelly were now staring down serious federal charges, but the video told the story best, from multiple airport security cameras and both officers' body cams especially. Donnelly's came a seamless, unforgiving timeline. It began with the stop, Green's eyes narrowing as Celeste Monroe walked past him. Then the questions, invasive, irrelevant, charged with condescension. The tone was unmistakable, Green's words sharp and slurred with superiority. Donnelly's silence, his hesitant glances, his subtle complicity, and then the demand. Green's voice recorded clearly. Let's not make this a problem. 1,000 in cash. Nobody has to know. Even those watching the raw footage in closed sessions winced. 1 week into the investigation, Donnelly, pressured by mounting evidence and his own guilty conscience, did something Green never expected. He flipped, with legal counsel at his side and a signed cooperation agreement in place. Officer Jake Donnelly gave a full recorded statement. He admitted to following Green's lead, acknowledged that the stop was based on profiling, and confirmed that the extortion attempt had been rehearsed. I didn't know who she was, he said, voice flat and eyes hollow. But that shouldn't have mattered. I knew it was wrong, I just didn't stop it. His testimony was damning, not only because it corroborated the video, but because it shattered any defense. Green's team had been scrambling to construct. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a strategy, a shakedown masked in a badge. Green, meanwhile, refused all interviews. His attorney attempted a damage control campaign in the media, insisting the stop had been routine, the comments misunderstood, and the demand for money never intended as a bribe. But none of it held water, especially not with Donnelly's confession and hours of footage speaking louder than any prepared statement. Back at the FBI's New York office, Celeste Monroe monitored developments without fanfare. Her name appeared only once in the press statement, carefully phrased as a federal official of undisclosed seniority. She made no public appearances, offered no commentary. The case, after all, wasn't about who she was. It was about what they did, and what they did was now irreversible. The storm Green and Donnelly set in motion had become a reckoning, one built not on rage but on record, on facts, on the law. They thought they could bend, and soon they would learn justice doesn't blink. It builds. The marble halls of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York echoed with tension the morning United States v. Green and Donnelly was called to order. It wasn't just another corruption case. Not this time. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, law students, law enforcement officers, civil rights attorneys, and quietly watching from the gallery young black professionals who'd seen too much and been believed too little. At the front, Prosecutor Nathan Ling adjusted his tie once, then stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The evidence, he said, will show a deliberate act of racial profiling, followed by an attempted extortion committed in broad daylight at one of the busiest airports in America against a black woman whose only crime was success. It was the kind of sentence that needed no flourish. It just landed. Ling began with the surveillance footage. A quiet click from the courtroom technician, and the monitors flickered to life. There, in high definition, was Celeste Monroe, composed, silent, being stopped, questioned, then handcuffed by officers Mason Green and Jake Donnelly. The audio from Donnelly's body cam filled the courtroom next. There was Green's voice, smooth and sharp. "Come on, just a little goodwill, 1,000 in cash and we forget the whole thing." And later his tone thick with racial undertone. "You don't look like you belong in first class, ma'am." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. The judge didn't flinch, but her pen stopped moving. Then came Donnelly's testimony. In a suit that looked a size too big for his shame, he took the stand. His voice cracked, but he spoke every word. "It wasn't her. It was us. We weren't trained to act like that, we chose to." He admitted to everything. The profiling. The fear. The silence. The temptation of easy money in a system that rarely punished quiet corruption. But his voice wavered most when he described Celeste. She wasn't angry, she was still. That stillness. It scared me more than if she'd screamed, but the silence in the courtroom reached its own sharp edge when Dr. Celeste Monroe took the stand. There was no need to introduce her with her title, though the prosecution did. The government calls Director Celeste Monroe Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words hung like cathedral bells. Celeste stepped forward in a navy suit, modest, clean lines, no jewelry, save for a simple watch. She took the oath with one hand, and with the other she held the truth. She testified with calm precision. Not anger, not drama, just clarity. "I cooperated. I answered questions. I asked for probable cause. I asked for legal justification. I received none." She described the moment she was handcuffed. "I knew what was happening, but more than that, I knew why." Her voice never rose, but it carved through the courtroom like a chisel through stone. She recounted every detail, the extortion demand, the veiled threats, the way Green had scanned her like a suspect before saying a single word. When the defense tried to question her judgment, why she hadn't revealed her position earlier, she looked straight at the jury. "I wanted to see what would happen if I were just another black woman in an expensive suit." No one moved, no one breathed, because they already knew the answer. The prosecution rested that afternoon, and by then the case wasn't just about Green and Donnelly. It was about power, about perception, about the quiet rot that grows unchecked in places that don't expect to be watched. And as the judge adjourned for the day, the gallery stood not in applause but in stunned, reverent silence. The reckoning had arrived and the gavel had yet to fall. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. 4 hours to decide the fate of two men whose badges had once shielded them from scrutiny and whose unchecked power had nearly destroyed their own careers, and something far more sacred, When the clerk called the courtroom back to order, a low hum of anticipation stirred like static. Judge Lorraine Farrow took the bench, her gaze sweeping across the packed room. She gave no speech, no preamble, just a nod. The foreperson, a middle-aged black man with rimless glasses and a trembling sheet of paper in his hands, rose in the matter of the United States versus Mason Green and Jake Donnelly. A pause. The room held its breath. "We, the jury, find both defendants guilty on all counts." The words struck like thunder in a silent sky. Mason Green's face collapsed. The bravado he had worn like armor in every appearance shattered as the reality landed. Jake Donnelly swallowed hard and closed his eyes as if bracing for something long overdue. Neither man moved. Neither man could judge Farrow. Her voice, now firm and unblinking, moved forward with sentencing. She reviewed the charges: civil rights violations under color of law, attempted extortion under the Hobbs Act, and abuse of authority in a public setting. To Mason Green, the architect of the crime, she gave 12 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole in the first 10. His sentence included mandatory civil rights retraining upon release and a permanent ban from public service to Jake Donnelly, whose cooperation had helped secure a conviction, but who had nonetheless stood silent in the face of injustice. She handed down 8 years reduced for his testimony, but firm enough to reflect the gravity of complicity. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause, but it shifted. Shoulders softened. Some sighed in disbelief. Others wept quietly. A few, like the group of young black law students seated in the gallery's front row, simply nodded, acknowledging that for once justice had arrived without knocking. Then Celeste stood. At the court's invitation, she delivered her victim impact statement. No theatrics, no resentment, just truth. She walked to the podium in silence. Then she looked not at the judge, but at the two men who had tried to humiliate her. "You didn't recognize me," she said, her voice even. "But you didn't need to. Because what matters is not who I am, but what you assumed I wasn't." Her words hung in the room like a flag at half-mast. "You assumed I didn't belong, that my presence, my success, my silence were threats. And in doing so, you reminded this country of a terrible truth, that in too many places the color of your skin still determines how the law sees you." She turned to the gallery. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every traveler who walks into a terminal, every citizen pulled over on a dark road, every voice dismissed before it speaks." Her voice deepened, measured and firm. "We need a culture shift in law enforcement, one that prioritizes accountability over silence, respect over ego, and justice over control." She concluded with a single sentence. "I wasn't afraid of you, but you should be afraid of what happens when the system finally holds up a mirror." Then she returned to her seat. The judge nodded solemnly. Court was adjourned, and as Green and Donnelly were escorted out in cuffs, this time not with power in their pockets but consequences at their backs, the world outside stirred with the first winds of change. A gavel had fallen. Yes, but something far louder had just begun to rise. In the days following the verdict, the air around Westbridge seemed heavier, not with tension but with the weight of reckoning. For the first time in decades, the police department that served the region's busiest international gateway stood under the harshest scrutiny it had ever faced. Mason Green and Jake Donnelly's convictions had sent a jolt through the heart of Westbridge's law enforcement leadership. But it wasn't just about two men. It was about a culture, a quiet, corrosive current of unchecked power bias disguised as protocol and silence passed off as professionalism. And that culture was now being dismantled. Westbridge Police Department launched a formal overhaul under the guidance of a newly appointed interim chief, a black woman named Vanessa Ward, with a background in civil rights law and a reputation for refusing to compromise. The first order of business: mandatory anti-bias training across the entire department. Not the checkbox kind, but a curriculum co-developed with federal advisors and psychologists focused on lived experience, implicit perception, and systemic impact. All airport officers were retrained on the limits of stop and search authority, with body cameras required to be active at all times during civilian interaction. Those caught disabling them would face immediate suspension. The union resisted. Ward didn't budge. The Department of Justice, too, took notice. New protocols were circulated nationwide. Airport precincts in Atlanta, LA, and Dallas received similar guidance on screening practices and civil rights procedures. Westbridge had become the lesson. Across the media landscape, Dr. Celeste Monroe became a symbol. Photos of her calm face framed by cuffed wrists and defiant silence spread across editorials and think pieces, elegance under pressure, dignity that refused to yield. She was praised not only for her composure, but for the power she held back, for not using her position as a weapon, but as a mirror. Journalists requested interviews, networks wanted exclusives, activists held up her name in protests and town halls. But Celeste Monroe declined every offer because she felt no joy, only a deeper kind of resolve. She hadn't needed the courtroom's verdict to validate what she already knew, that Green and Donnelly had abused their badges, and that no amount of decorum could mask contempt when it showed itself so brazenly. What unsettled her was how quickly it had happened, how thin the line was between casual suspicion and criminal misconduct, how easily silence formed around wrongdoing when its target wore the wrong skin. In her office at the Hoover Building, Celeste sat alone one evening, the city lights of Washington, D.C. glimmering like scattered embers across the skyline. On her desk were updates, revised field protocols, partnership offers from civil rights organizations, letters from airport security agencies wanting consultation. All of it proof that her ordeal had sparked something bigger. And yet the moment she remembered most vividly wasn't the press conference, the verdict, or even the handcuffs. It was the expression on Green's face, smugness turned to horror. The instant she had said director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That flash of realization had nothing to do with her title. It was the moment he saw himself unmasked. And it was a reminder to her that power without accountability is nothing more than danger wearing a badge. Celeste didn't need applause. She didn't want admiration. What she wanted was what she'd always worked for, a system worthy of public trust. One that didn't just apologize after harm had been done, but prevented it before it could begin. Because the work of justice was not a performance. It was a duty, and it never ended. The verdict had echoed. The reforms had begun. But for Dr. Celeste Monroe, the story was never about a courtroom victory. It was about what came next, about ensuring that what happened at Westbridge International Airport wasn't just remembered, but prevented. In the weeks following the trial, Celeste found herself drawn not to press conferences or public speaking circuits, but to something quieter, deeper, and more deliberate. A proposal had landed on her desk, drafted not by a political strategist or a federal consultant, but by a group of young civil rights attorneys, aviation security experts, and former community advocates. At the top of the first page, printed in bold serif font, was the title, The Monroe Doctrine for Domestic Oversight. It wasn't a policy. It was a framework, a blueprint for what an accountable, ethical, and racially just security system could look like, not just at airports, but in schools, train stations, and on public streets. It called for independent civilian review boards and transit security real-time, flagging of racially disproportionate stops, and the creation of a new federal liaison division to investigate misconduct in border zones and transportation hubs. It was ambitious, expansive, and desperately needed. Celeste read it twice, then called a meeting. She brought in Naomi Reyes, a brilliant young analyst who had once interned with the FBI's behavioral division, but left disillusioned by the lack of outreach to underserved communities. She called in retired Agent Lyle Park, an old friend who had grown up in rural Mississippi and spent his career quietly mentoring first-generation recruits of color. She called in voices who had been excluded for too long. And from that table, a new body was born. The Monroe Initiative, not a vanity project, not a press stunt, but a long-term watchdog organization structured as an independent nonprofit with bipartisan funding and a board drawn from civil society, not bureaucracy. Its mission was clear: to monitor racial equity and ethical enforcement standards across all points of federal and local authority, with teeth, with reach, and with people who understood both systems and communities. Celeste declined to be its president. "I don't need to run it," she told the board. "I need it to outlive me." Her only request, that it operate without deference to rank, but never without deference to truth. As the Monroe Initiative launched, something else arrived at Celeste's door. No name, no return address. Just a sealed envelope, hand-delivered by courier. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stock paper, typed, centered, unadorned. "The roots run deeper than Westbridge. The tree still grows. Choose your next steps carefully." Director Celeste stared at the message for a long time. She felt no fear, only clarity. She folded the note, slid it into a drawer beside dozens of others she had received over the years. Threats, warnings, political smokescreens, disguised as concern. Then she stood, crossed the room, and stared out the window of her office, her reflection mirrored against the city she served. Below her, the wheels of power still turned, still slow, still imperfect. But turning behind her in the next room, a new generation was already at work, drafting briefs, analyzing cases, preparing to audit institutions that had once seemed untouchable. And that was the point, because the legacy of power isn't what you hold, it's what you pass on. Celeste Monroe didn't need a monument. She had started something better, a reckoning, a reimagining, and most importantly, a continuation. In a world where power is often abused behind closed doors, Dr. Celeste Monroe didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She didn't need to threaten, argue, or shout. She let the system expose itself, then held it accountable, piece by piece. And in doing so, she reminded us that real strength isn't loud, it's composed, it's precise, and it never forgets. Because justice isn't about revenge, it's about rebuilding trust where it was broken. And sometimes, it starts with someone brave enough to stand still while the world watches her fall, just so she can rise stronger in full view. If this story moved you, if you believe we need more accountability, more courage, and more Celeste Monroes in the world, click like. Drop a comment. Tell us what part hit you hardest. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that cuts deep and demands better. Because tomorrow we speak truth again. And you'll want to be here when we do.